Virtuoso podcast. My name is Jonathan Curtis, and in the introduction there, we were listening to an excerpt from a duet for snare drum and marimba entitled Jig. This is from my collection of duets called the Music Box Suite. Now, today we're going to be tackling a really important topic, the topic of practice, the idea, the concept, the methodology behind what makes practice actually work. This is an often misunderstood topic, despite its importance for virtually learning any skill. So I'm going to be breaking down the two fundamental ideas of practicing and look at some tried and tested and scientifically verified methods for getting the most out of it. Now, before we begin, if you like what you hear in these podcasts, you are welcome to visit me at my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, which has all the information about me, my publications, my music and compositions, online lessons for anybody interested in studying further, and of course access to my hundreds of educational and performance-based videos on YouTube /JCurtisDrums. Before we go any further, let's listen to another piece of music for snare drum. This is from Will Coxon's collection. This is one of my favourite pieces from Will Coxon. It's called simply Solo Number 128, and it is from his collection of 150 solos called The All-American Drummer. So, before we go any further, let's enjoy Will Coxon, Solo Number 128. Wonderful. I love that piece. I love the use of crushed rolls in the larger figure. It makes for some really fast phrasing, but I think it sounds great. So solo 128 there. Now, moving on to the topic of hand, practice. One of the main ideas I want to talk about today is the idea of practice itself being a skill. Considering how important the act of practicing is to learning any skill, it is surprisingly misunderstood. Very few people actually know how to practice properly, despite their best intentions. People make studious and concerted efforts to practice, yet if they don't know how to do it, it can, sadly, just be wasted time. So part of learning an instrument, part of learning any skill, is actually learning how to practice first. Once we understand how to practice, we might be surprised at how fast we can actually progress. So, in order to tackle this topic, I'm going to break it down into two main elements, what I've called deliberate practice or formal practice, and then engagement practice. And both of these are really, really important for us to actually learn a skill in any great detail. Now, anything I talk about today, in theory, is applicable to any skill, but as this is a drumming podcast, I'm going to talk specifically about snare drumming. But the principles should and do apply regardless of whatever the skill actually is. So, to begin with, deliberate practice. In order to understand deliberate practice, and before we come on to the principles involved, we need to understand one very important point. Learning happens in the brain and the nervous system. Now, this may sound obvious, but it is really, really important. It is the foundation for all of the principles that are to come. So when we learn something, yes, there might be physical changes in the musculature as conditioning occurs or strengthening occurs, but actual learning, the act that allows us to perform a skill better, occurs in the brain and, by extension, the nervous system. And this is the idea that the brain sends out signals through the nervous system to the muscles and the muscles obey. So the whole idea behind deliberate practice is allowing those signals to travel in the most efficient manner. We want to get rid of, to simplify, leakage, for example, or delays or confusions. If we think of it like a road network, we want those signals to be traveling down clear motorways that are direct. We don't want them to be taking congested back roads. So the idea of deliberate practice is founded on the concept that learning happens in the brain. Now, I don't want to go into the rabbit hole right now of neuroscience, but there have been many neurological studies, surveys, tests, and controlled groups and all these sorts of things that have shown again and again that these principles work, and they work because we can actually see the changes in the brain. We have this process of neuroplasticity, where the brain physically changes itself to accommodate the new signals and sequences and patterns that we are trying to learn. So it's a very powerful process. So essentially, deliberate practice is founded on the idea that we need to cater for and accommodate and allow for and encourage neuroplasticity. We need the brain to change itself, to grow and to expand in order to accommodate the thing we are trying to learn. That's really, really important to understand. I say this because one of the most common terms thrown around when referring to practicing is this idea of muscle memory. Now, muscle memory is a useful thing to talk about, but it is a complete misnomer. Muscles have no memory. Muscles are completely inert and they are not able to store memory of any kind. I know that may sound obvious. I know that may sound like I'm following a dead end here, but it's really important to get this out the way early on. Muscles have no memory. Muscles cannot learn. Muscles obey the signals that they receive, and they do it in a dumb manner. They have no actual intelligence. They certainly have no memory. Now, the only way that muscles can aid in the act being performed is if they need to get stronger in order to perform it. If I can currently lift a 20 kilo weight and I want to lift a 30 kilo weight, I have to make my muscles stronger. But that is not the same as learning a skill. If I'm trying to perform a scale on my hand on the piano, I need to train my brain, not my muscles. Muscle conditioning may occur on a very minor scale, but nothing like the changes that happen when learning to lift a heavier weight. So, with that said, we do need to bear in mind that everything we are going to talk about in terms of deliberate practice is based on the idea that the brain does the learning. We need to encourage that and accommodate that. So, with that said, what is deliberate practice and how do we do it? Essentially, deliberate practice is based on 5 main principles. And those principles need to happen in the correct manner, in the correct order. And if those 5 principles are followed, learning occurs. So, what are the 5 principles? Well, we have a goal, we have focus, we have feedback, we have repetition, and then reinforcement. Goal, focus, feedback, repetition, reinforcement. These are the 5 pillars of practicing. And if we follow them correctly and we do each stage correctly, we will improve. So let's talk about each of these in turn and how we can use this to actually aid us in our own practicing. First of all, a goal. It is often understated, misunderstood, or neglected outright, but practicing is pointless without a goal. I often see people go to great lengths writing for themselves a really comprehensive practice plan. And it probably takes 6 hours throughout the day, and they've allocated half an hour to rudiments and 25 minutes to coordination and half an hour to sight reading and whatever else it may be. And people fall into this trap of trying to cover everything all in one go. I need to practice my rudiments. I need to practice my sight reading. I need to practice my coordination. I need to practice that Latin pattern. I need to practice X, Y, and Z. So they try to cram it all in to some super practice session that when you've finished it, you've practiced everything and you are therefore better. Now, I know this because I used to do this myself. I was terrible for waking up one morning, feeling frustrated, getting out the notepad, and rather than actually practicing, I'd spend the next 2 hours writing out the most elaborate practice plan you could possibly imagine, and then 2 weeks later finding myself right back at square one because I either couldn't complete the plan because it was too long and too arduous and too elaborate, or I completed the plan and didn't really notice any benefit for my efforts. Now, the reason this is the case is because it's not goal orientated. So rule number one of practicing is it has to be goal orientated. We need to have a goal in mind, and crucially, that goal needs to be achievable and measurable. So simply practicing to get better, to improve, is not good enough because we can't measure that. We can't achieve that in any meaningful manner. If I practice a paradiddle on a pad for 10 minutes, am I better or not? How do I measure that? How do I even know? It's not helpful. It's not meaningful. So the first thing we need to do is establish a very clear goal. Now, for me, as somebody with a lot of experience behind me, I've practiced in every way imaginable, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them productive, some of them not so. These days, 25 years into my playing career, the entirety of my practice, let's say 95 to 99% of my practice time, is spent learning pieces. And I learn a piece and I record it and I perform it and then I move on to another piece. And I have found this to be the single most beneficial way, the most productive way for me to improve, because when I decide I want to perform a piece, I start it and I find that I can't perform it. And then after I've learned it and practiced it, I can perform it. It is a very clear, very measurable goal. And after each one, I can look back and say, yep, I've done it. I couldn't perform that piece and now I can. Now, that's just me. The where I am in my playing career at the moment with my work and my publications and things like that, performing pieces is a really worthwhile thing that I do. It's a really worthwhile part of my job and my output. For you, for anybody else, it doesn't matter what the goal is, but it must be achievable and it must be measurable. So it might be something as simple as I'm going to learn this grade 3 piece as part of my graded exam, or I'm going to learn this exercise to tempo, or I'm going to learn this passage of this solo, whatever it may be. As I say, measurable and achievable. Now, from there, we come on to the 3 parts of actual practice: focus, feedback, and repetition. Now, let's start with the first of those, focus. This is, again, an often neglected element of deliberate practice. Now, in one sense, it's the most obvious thing in the world. We need to focus on what we are doing. And many people simply don't. I hear a lot of people talk about practicing by sticking the TV on and tapping away on a pad for the duration of a film. And I certainly don't wish to detract from anybody's genuine efforts to improve. But neuroscientific studies have shown again and again that without focus, mindless repetition is completely useless. It doesn't achieve what we need it to achieve. It doesn't engage the brain. It doesn't engage neuroplasticity. It doesn't engage any kind of learning or development whatsoever. So the idea of focus is simply focusing on what you are doing. While you are practicing, your attention is on practicing. Again, it sounds obvious, but it is a really important starting point. Now, interestingly, when we ask the question of, okay, well, what do I focus on? The answer seems to be, based on our scientific findings so far, and do bear in mind this is an ongoing topic of research, the answer seems to be it doesn't actually matter. What matters is that you are focusing. Now, if I'm practicing in front of the mirror, for example, I can focus on the height of my stick's tips. I can practice on the angle of my hands. I can focus on the angle of my hands. I can focus on speed, or I can focus on rhythm, or I can focus on my fulcrum, or all these myriad tiny little details I can focus on. Again, the answer seems to be, as far as we can tell, it doesn't matter as long as I'm focusing. Now, the reason behind this seems to be that the act of focusing is like a call to arms for the brain. It's like saying, look, what we're doing is important, so switch on and pay attention. So this is the first step in engaging our neuroplasticity, okay? This is the first step in telling our brain, we are in practice mode now, we are learning. Pay attention. This can't happen without focus. So when we sit down or stand up to practice, however we do it, the first thing we want to ensure we are doing once we've actually established a goal for ourselves is simply that we are paying attention for the duration of our practice time. Now, there is actually a really simple way to know if this has worked. By the time you are finished, you will feel mentally tired. If you've done a long session, you will feel mentally exhausted because it takes energy to maintain and sustain a level of focus. If after 20 minutes of focused, dedicated practice, you are feeling tired mentally, good. It's done its job. You were focusing and the brain has been working. If you've been noodling away for an hour and you feel bored and restless, you probably haven't been focusing. So this is one of the really important stages we need to make sure we're doing every time in order to engage the brain, to tell it to sit up and take notice. We simply need to focus on what we are doing. Now, focus is a finite resource. We can't just focus indefinitely for extended periods of time. A few years ago, quite a few years ago now, I got really interested in the work of Mike Mangini. Now, he's obviously a phenomenal drummer. He's played with all sorts of bands. Most recently, he played with Dream Theater. And he released a pair of books, Rhythm Knowledge, they were called, Rhythm Knowledge Volumes 1 and 2. And in one of the volumes, he goes into great detail about methods of practice, similar to what I'm talking about here. And on the topic of focus and latterly repetition, which I will come to, he talks about practicing for 90 minutes at a time. Now, a young me, who was very influenced by such things, I decided straight away there and then, right, well, I'm going to practice something for 90 minutes at a time. And I developed all sorts of elaborate practice systems, and I would simply repeat something for 90 minutes. And of course, you can guess what I'm going to say. I couldn't keep my focus. Maintaining focus for 90 minutes is incredibly difficult. Now, in Mike Mangini's defense, he does talk about lots of different methods and things you can do while doing these extended periods to maintain your focus. But I'll come on to those a little bit later on. My point for now is that focus is important, whether you're doing 5 minutes or 50 minutes. It really doesn't matter as long as you are sustaining focus. Now, the next step we come on to is feedback. And this is another often neglected element that is actually vitally important for practice. So practicing can happen, feedback happens, in one of two ways, autodidactically or via a teacher or mentor. So autodidactic feedback is where you are essentially giving yourself feedback, and the third-party feedback is where it's happening through a teacher or a coach who is watching you and providing feedback at the time. Now, generally speaking, autodidactic feedback is the most common and generally the most productive so long as you know what you're doing. For beginners and those less experienced, it is vitally important you get correct feedback from an authority who knows what they are doing, who knows what they are talking about. Now, regardless of where that feedback comes from, feedback is the act of cross-referencing the action as you are performing it currently against the action as you would like to perform it ideally. So this is really worth bearing out and exploring this idea here. When we practice something, we've set our goal. We want to have an idea in mind of what that goal looks like once we have accomplished it. So let's just say we're practicing something very, very simple, like the first two measures of a snare drum solo. We need to be very clear in our minds what those first two measures need to sound like. We need to take into account the rhythm, the tempo, the meter, the dynamics, the accents, the ornamentation, like the flams and things like that, such that ideally we would want to be able to sing it to ourselves. We want to be very clear in our own minds what that passage should sound like. Furthermore, we want to have a very clear idea of what that passage should feel like to play, what the technique might look like if we're doing it in an ideal situation. We want to have a clear idea in mind of the end goal. Now, when we practice and we are focusing on this practice and we are repeating this action slowly, we can cross-reference the way we are doing it now against that idealized version. So we may say to ourselves, and this is all happening in real time as we are performing the repetitions, we may say to ourselves, my accents aren't strong enough. My taps are too loud. My rhythm in this section is wrong. My meter is suffering. I'm speeding up. I'm slowing down. My rolls aren't articulated. My stick heights aren't even. My right hand is angled differently to my left. Again, all these myriad details we can focus on. Feedback is this concept that we are constantly checking them and making small adjustments to try to bridge the gulf between where we are now with this action and where we want to be. Now, as I say, when this feedback is happening through a teacher, the teacher will be doing this for us. We will be focusing as best we can on the action, and the teacher will be making these observations. Your left stick is angled inwards, stronger accents, keep your stick heights lower. And as we listen to this and receive this feedback, we're trying to make those adjustments on the fly as we go. As we become more experienced practicers and we know what we are looking for, we know what we're doing, we can do this ourselves. So this is why practicing in front of a mirror is so important. As I'm practicing something, I'm watching all of these things and I'm giving myself feedback mentally as I go. Oh, that left hand stick was too high. My angles are looking weird. Why is my left hand angled inwards? And I'm making corrections as I go. So it's this real-time cross-referencing, as I've said, between where we are now and where we want to be. Now, these are really important concepts, but without this third one, they don't matter. And this third one is, of course, repetition. We all know that practice involves repetition, but without these preceding steps, the repetition itself is useless, but without repetition, those preceding steps are useless. We can't get better at something just by focusing on it and having feedback. We have to actually do the repetition. Now, the repetition is like the canvas on which the brain paints when it's learning. It is giving it the space, the time, and the real-time activity to actually process, incorporate all of the feedback, and make the changes it needs to. Now, the question is always, how many repetitions should I do? Should I be doing 10 at a time, or should I be doing 10,000 in one go? Like Mike Mangini said, should I be doing 90 minutes of repetition at a time? Is that what I need to be doing? Well, again, referring to various neuroscientific studies, the answer seems to be as many as you can while retaining focus and feedback. Now, that, on the face of it, seems to be a really vacuous answer. That doesn't really seem to tell us much, but actually it's probably the most productive we could hope to receive, because the focus and the feedback combined with the repetition is where the learning occurs, but only when all three of those elements are employed together. So if we are only capable of focusing for, let's say, 12 repetitions of something before our mind starts to wander, then do 12 and then pause and have a break, and then do another 12 and pause and have a break, and then another 12 and another 12. There's no point, literally, there is no point in forcing yourself to do X number of repetitions just to reach an arbitrary number if by repetition 15 you're staring out the window and you're on autopilot. So repetition is all well and good so long as you can sustain the process, so long as you can sustain the focus and the feedback. So what I generally do, and I'll come to this later on, I'll talk about some practical ways we can do this in a little while, but what I generally do is I work in chunks of 12. So if I am learning, let's say, the first 4 bars of a solo, I will play those 4 bars 12 times through. So it's like one set of 12 repetitions, and then I'll have a break. And then I'll do another set of 12 repetitions, and then I'll have a break. And I will build up my repetition that way. Some people may be able to go longer than that. Some people may be able to do 100 repetitions at a time. And that's fine if you can sustain the focus. So these things, as I say, they all need to combine. And when we combine focus, feedback, and repetition, we get practice. we get results, we get the benefit. This is where the learning actually occurs. Now, there's a few things that we can start to talk about here to bring this home. But before I do, let's talk about the fifth pillar, reinforcement. We've established our goal, we've maintained our focus, we've received real-time feedback, and we've sustained repetition. The practice has actually happened and the learning has begun. We now need to reinforce it. And this is the idea that if we don't do it frequently, regularly, we lose the progress we've made. So I might have the most wonderful, productive practice session on a Monday, but if I haven't reinforced that process by, say, Wednesday, if I don't practice again until Friday, studies seem to suggest that we lose up to 90% of the progress we made on the Monday. We generally have a period of about 24 to 48 hours in which to reinforce that progress before we actually start to lose that progress. So generally speaking, reinforcement is the idea of doing the same thing frequently over the course of days or weeks. It's no good having one outrageous 8-hour practice session and then doing nothing again for a week because we're exhausted. Far better if we have a productive 20 minutes to an hour and then do it again the next day and the next day and the next day and keep that up with regular reinforcement. So this, of course, implies we want to be practicing the same thing, right? It's no good doing coordination on Monday and rudiments on Tuesday and a piece on Wednesday and something else on Thursday because we're not reinforcing the things we're learning. So far better, once we've got our goal, to stick to it over prolonged periods of time, reinforcing it with the same methodical process again and again and strengthening the learning that actually happens. Now, again, coming back to the neuroscience of it all, this reinforcement has been shown to make real significant changes. It strengthens and reinforces the actual changes that are occurring in the brain. So it's like if we walk across a field just once, it makes no impact on the grass. Whereas if we take that route the same time every day, maybe to and from school, eventually we will be wearing a path across the field. It's kind of the same thing here. We want to be performing the same actions again and again under these strictly methodical conditions in order to reinforce the new pathways that we are building, the new signal transmission routes we're building for ourselves within our brain. So reinforcement in one sense is a very simple concept. When you've done a really good practice session, do it again within the next day or two to maintain, reinforce, and expand upon that progress. Otherwise, we risk losing it. So this is essentially it as far as deliberate practice goes. We have our goal, we focus, we have feedback, we conduct repetition, and then we repeat that process regularly to reinforce it. This is essentially how we practice. Now, there are a number of things we can do and a number of other topics we can discuss here to elaborate on this a little bit more to help us get the most out of it. First of all, when we conduct the repetitions, how fast should we be going? And what about the idea of mistakes? Now, there is an outdated theory, many musicians have been taught this, that you should practice slowly enough to repeat the motion perfectly every time. And despite it being such a well-embedded and ingrained concept, the latest neurological studies seem to suggest that this is not ideal. We don't want to be repeating something perfectly every time. In fact, the latest findings, I'm referring specifically to work studied by Andrew Huberman here, suggest that mistakes within repetition are actually vital as part of the feedback process. And he was so convinced by this that he told us to, I'm referencing, by the way, Andrew Huberman's YouTube show, his podcast about neuroplasticity, well worth checking out, by the way. But he's talking about these studies and referencing these studies. He's so convinced by this that he talks about a tennis player practicing serves. And he says, if this tennis player does 1,000 serves and only 3 of them are good, it is still valuable. Those 3 are more valuable than the 997 that were not good. So how fast do we practice and should we be making mistakes? Well, the general consensus from the findings seems to be that we want to be practicing in such a way that we are making a mistake sometime around 10 or 20% of the time. 10 to 20% of the time, we are getting it slightly wrong. And this gives us opportunity to correct on a much more significant scale. Maybe I don't perform the double stroke quite cleanly enough 1 in 5 times. Maybe roughly 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 times I get the rhythm of the triplet wrong. Whatever it may be, if I'm practicing so slowly that I'm getting it correct every single time 100%, I'm practicing too slowly. I need to bump it up a little bit to where I'm still in control, but just a few mistakes are creeping in that I can then correct. And apparently, again, I'm referencing here, apparently these mistakes are what the brain focuses on when it replays the practice later on. So what do I mean by this? Studies have shown, once again, that after extended periods of practice, 2 things happen. The first thing is that if we rest immediately after a practice session, the brain replays that practice session to itself in terms of neurological activity. Secondly, when we go to sleep that night, the brain does that again in reverse and very, very fast. Now, this is really exciting. These are really exciting findings. And again, it seems to be the case that the brain is able to process the mistakes and troubleshoot what went wrong and focus on the good ones and to kind of amalgamate this information so that next time we're better prepared to perform the action. In other words, it's learning from its mistakes. It's going back over what it was repeated, what it was shown, and it can cross-reference, it can troubleshoot, it can correct. So this is really, really exciting. So generally speaking, when we're doing our focused feedback-based repetition, we want to be practicing just under our maximum, where we are still comfortable, still in control, but not quite fully confident. We've just got a few mistakes creeping in, and we do our best through feedback to correct them. And these mistakes are significant contributors to our brain's ability to actually improve at the action. Another topic we can talk about here is an idea called random block practice. And this is based on the principle that the brain actually learns better at the beginning of an action rather than through sustained repetition. So the idea behind this, and again, all supported by scientific studies, the idea behind this is that it is better to take 2 or 3 things that we are practicing on and transition between them than it is to take one thing and do it endlessly. Now, I know this kind of counteracts what I said previously about taking one goal and sticking to it. Whereas rather than practicing loads of different things in a completely disparate manner, we can practice a number of linked things in a sequential manner and apply all the same principles. So what do I mean by this? Let's say my goal is to learn a piece of music. And let's say that piece of music is 4 sections long, A, B, C, and D. And just for argument's sake, let's say each section is 8 bars long. So there's 8 bars of A, 8 bars of B, and so on. Now, I may take 2 of those sections, A and B, and I may go through all the aforementioned processes for each of those in an alternating manner. So I may do 12 repetitions through A in a focused, feedback-based manner. Then I may do 12 repetitions of B, and then I go back and do 12 more of A, and then 12 more of B, and I repeat and reinforce this process regularly throughout the week. Now, random block practicing says we can do this with as many as 3 or 4 different elements, and actually we can take it one step further and randomize the one we practice each time. So if our solo has 4 sections, A, B, C, and D, I can practice A for 12 repetitions. Then I might do D for 12, then A again, then B, then C, then A, then D in a random fashion, or at least a jumbled order. And the act of starting a new one kind of forces the brain to relearn the crucial elements, the fundamental elements of this. Now, I see something similar to this when I'm working with students. It's okay getting them to practice a drum fill in isolation. When I get them to transition into it from the previous bar, it can be much more difficult. And this is the principle on which this idea is based. The transition into a new action is the hardest and also the most significant part of learning that action. So random block practicing says jump between numerous things that you're trying to learn at once, and you'll kind of jumpstart the brain into learning those actions quickly. Finally, then, to end this topic of deliberate practice, I want to talk about something I've talked about before briefly, contextual and non-contextual practice. Non-contextual practice describes the idea of taking something in isolation and practicing it in isolation, i.e. no context. So I might practice a paradiddle. Now, a paradiddle out of context isn't really music, it's just a pattern between the hands. But non-contextual practice is the idea that we are just focusing on that pattern and we are improving our execution with it. In contrast, contextual practice is the idea that we are practicing something within a particular context. So I may want to practice my paradiddles rather than take them out of any context and practice them in isolation. I might work on a piece that happens to contain lots of paradiddles. I may work on a John Pratt piece or something that's got lots of paradiddles in it, and I learn paradiddles as part of this broader context. Now, I've talked about this before. I talked about this when engaging with the repertoire, and I've talked about this in books, and I've talked about this on YouTube. It goes without saying here, contextual practice is by far the most efficient and productive, because this harks back to what I said on one of the early episodes about technique. Half of technique, a big portion of technique, is in understanding what we are practicing. So when you practice something out of context, you're not getting the understanding, you're just getting the isolated pattern. When we practice something in context, you're getting all of the contextual information about that, the transitioning into and out of it, as we've just said, which is a very significant factor. We're getting its function and application, and we're getting unusual choreography of motions. We may have to transition from a 5-stroke roll into a paradiddle, which we've never done before. And we may have to transition from that paradiddle into a flamacue, which we've never done before. Tackling those puzzles is far more beneficial for learning a paradiddle than simply taking a paradiddle out of context. So, to summarize this first section on deliberate practice, set a goal that is measurable and achievable. Work on that goal with focus, maintaining attention on what you're doing. Have feedback either from yourself, using something like a mirror or paying close attention as you're watching and listening to yourself, or from a teacher or mentor, providing very real-time practical feedback. And repeat. Repeat for as long as you are able to maintain focus. Reinforce this process regularly, if you can, numerous times throughout the day, and at least every 24 to 48 hours to reinforce and strengthen that process of learning. You can then start to adopt further methodologies like random block practicing, transitioning between multiple things at a time, and try to stay within context. So rather than just learning a paradiddle, work on a piece that contains paradiddles and learn it as part of the broader context. If we can follow these things regularly, our practicing should drastically improve, and we should find, and I have in my own experience, that progress and learning and the general betterment of our skill is much more efficient. It happens much more quickly, and thanks to having measurable goals, noticeably, we can actually look back and say, yep, I've improved. Now, with deliberate practice out of the way, we can move on to the second idea I mentioned, this idea of engagement-based practice. And sadly, as important as this is, it is probably the most neglected element of practice, at least in all of my students and many people I encounter, in my travels around the world and things like that, people that I talk to, people that I work with. This idea of engagement with the art form on a broader scale. Now, it's very easy to dismiss this when we're talking about neuroscience and scientific studies and neuroplasticity and things like this, very methodical and scientifically based processes that have been shown to increase our ability. It is very easy to dismiss something like engagement and subject knowledge, yet it is vitally important for our broader growth as musicians. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by this. Engagement with the art form means just that. It means we are engaging with the art form not just as somebody hitting a drum, but as a student of the art form. So this includes subject knowledge, which I'll come on to. It includes understanding the history, the traditions, the main concepts, the main ideas, key figures, key pieces of the repertoire. And it also involves actually consuming the art form as well. The most striking example I can give you here, I've had students in the past, and I still do have some students like this, who love the drums, they love drumming, they're studious with their practice, they turn up every week, they make progress. But when I say to them, who's your favourite drummer? Or even, who's your favourite band? They will say something like, I don't listen to music, or I don't have a favourite drummer. And both of these answers are staggering to me because A, why would you want to learn a musical instrument if you don't listen to music? And B, how can you expect to learn an instrument if you don't follow any players of that instrument? Because it is from the people that came before us who have mastered the craft that we look to for inspiration, that we look to for our learning. So I think it's vitally important that if we are a student of an art form, we actually engage with that art form. If you are learning jazz, listen to jazz. If you are learning to play music, listen to music. If you want to master the drums, listen to drummers alongside music. And I think having something like a favorite drummer is really important. Having that inspiration, having that motivation to imitate and learn from can be a very powerful tool. So I talked about this idea of subject knowledge. And again, this can be a passive thing or it can be an active thing. So active subject knowledge is going out of your way to learn more about it, conducting research, going and finding things, looking things up. You know, this might be something simple as taking a book out of the library and reading a bit about the history, or looking at a composer's back catalogue, or going to listen to as many recordings and videos as you can find about a specific performer. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's this engagement that deepens our own knowledge. So I'll give you an example of this. I was an enormous Vinnie Colaiuta fan when I was in my 20s. I mean, I still am. I think he's one of the greatest of all time. But in my 20s, I was absolutely committed to trying to understand and learn like Vinnie Colaiuta. And without really needing to be prompted or forced into it, I found myself seeking out everything he'd ever played on. I found myself seeking out all of the clinic appearances he'd made, all of the solos he'd performed, and I would listen to them, and I would transcribe them, or try to, and I would copy them, and I would spend hours trying to just understand what I was listening to. And I did the same with Dave Weckl. And when I was writing my book on broken time drumming, I did the same with jazz drumming. I listened to an enormous amount of Jack DeJohnette. I transcribed his playing. I tried to understand the phrases he was playing. Yes, it was research for a book, but it was still deep engagement with the art form that wasn't actually me with sticks in hands. I did this much more recently in 2020, I think it was, after the first COVID pandemic. I was conducting an Arts Council research project into the snare drum as a solo instrument, and I was researching solo snare drumming. I was researching the repertoire. I was researching composition techniques. I was conducting interviews. I was discussing ideas and concepts with great composers around the world who were good enough to talk to me. And I was immersed in this art form. And when I came out the other side, my knowledge and understanding of all aspects of it had so dramatically increased that I wondered how I'd ever managed before. So now, when I'm teaching somebody, let's say I'm teaching somebody a snare drum solo, I feel very confident in myself in explaining the whys and the hows and the whats of what's going on. I can say, yes, this is what's happening with the notes on the page, but I have that understanding of the history behind it, the applications, the musical concept behind it. Maybe even I know the composer or have studied the composer a lot, and I can talk about some of the intentions and idioms and characteristics of that composer. And this is such an important part of learning to play an instrument, yet so few musicians actually do this. So few musicians actually take the time to actively go and study the art form of which they're a part. So on an active level, we can research our favorite composers or performers, our favorite bands. We can research our favorite types of playing. We can research the history, the traditions, key figures, all sorts of elements that just make us better informed about this art form. Now, the second way of doing this is what I've called the passive way. And the best thing I can think of to describe this approach, the passive approach, is to describe a music fan who doesn't treat it like work, who doesn't treat it like a research project, but just loves what they're listening to. So I used to do this when I was a teenager. We'd go into the local CD shop or the vinyl shop when that was a thing, and we'd spend hours going through all the old CDs and find something new, and then we'd just go and listen to it. And we'd go and listen to it hundreds of times. We'd listen to it on the walk to and from school, and we'd talk about who we were listening to. And over the years of doing this, my friend and I, who was a big music lover with me, we found we started to develop this encyclopedic knowledge of the bands we would listen to. So of the albums in rotation at any given time, I could tell you the band members, I could tell you the year it was produced, I could tell you the studio, I could tell you the publisher, I could tell you everything about it. I could probably tell you the equipment the drummer used, who they were endorsing, and all sorts of things. Not because I went out of my way to research it, but just because I enjoyed it. I got really attached to the things I was listening to. I got really committed and involved and invested in it. So I wanted to learn these things. And it's really nice when I see this with my students. I've got a few students I can think of who every week they turn up with a new band t-shirt and they're excited because they've found a new band they like, or a new drummer they've discovered who they just can't stop listening to. And without any prompting from me, they've gone and learned about it. So they can tell me the year their favorite album was written. They can tell me what they like about it in a musical sense. They can tell me the band members, and this band member was also in that band that they also like, and that's really cool. And that's such an important aspect of learning an art form, once again, but this happens in a more passive manner. And this can also happen if you're just a fan, if you, as I say, consume the art form you're interested in. Maybe you're a ballet fan, maybe you love ballet, and you go to the theatre as often as you can to watch the latest Matthew Bourne production, or you go to see all of the shows with your favourite ballerina in it. And over the course of actually doing this regularly, you develop a deep knowledge of what you are listening to, of what you are watching. And this in turn can drastically help in your own performance when it comes to your own execution of the craft. So in one sense, yes, in order to improve, we need deliberate practice, as I've described it here. But in another sense, we need the further engagement with the art form itself. We want to be able to describe ourselves as students of the art form, not just drummers, not just snare drummers or not just drum kit players, but students of the art form, which brings with it a level of subject knowledge, a depth of understanding, whether that be academic, as I've described, knowing the history and the traditions and the concepts and things like that, or whether it just be a passive, deep familiarity with the things we listen to, the things we enjoy. And I think that's really it. So I think when I look at somebody like myself who has achieved a level of accomplishment in a certain field, yes, I've learned how to practice well, but yes, I have immersed myself in the greater art form. I've immersed myself in the history, the traditions, the key figures, and all these things I've talked about, such that if I'm teaching somebody else, I can tell them why, I can tell them the context, I can tell them a bit about the history, maybe the intentions and the characteristics of the composer, and everything else I've already described. And I think this makes a musician much more three-dimensional, rather than just somebody that has developed fantastic fast hands, but actually they don't know much about the instrument. So I would encourage any of you listening to this, yes, pay attention to the principles of deliberate practice. Yes, make sure you're following all of these studies to ensure you're actually practicing productively. But go and study the art form. Go and study it passively and study it actively. Go and consume it. Go and enjoy it. Immerse yourself in it. And I think you will find your understanding grows exponentially, as does your engagement with it. And I think this ultimately will help you become the musician you want to be. So I will leave that there. I think I've covered everything I wanted to cover about the idea of practicing today. I hope some of you have found this useful. As always, I am more than happy to discuss this further with anybody, so please feel free to get in touch through my website, jonathancurtis.co.uk, and I will look forward to the next episode, seeing you on the Snare Drum Virtuoso podcast. To play us out, I think we will listen to an old Nard piece. This is Cullerton's Nard March by J.P. Cullerton, and this is from the Nard Drum Book. Thank you very much. See you next time.